Buongiorno, Arielle. It's great to be here with you on this celebration of Dante's centenary. And maybe we can start our conversation by just saying a few words about what makes Dante a figure who's relevant today, 700 years after his death. And I've been pondering this, especially because this year is the 700th centenary. It seems to me the reason why he's relevant still today is he asks big questions. What's good? What's evil? How do we orient ourselves in the world today? How do we judge human behavior? Where do we find good leadership? And what constitutes bad leadership? Mm-hmm. Then the other thing that comes to mind is Dante takes up big topics. He has strong positions on injustice, the abuse of power, financial corruption, the corruption in the church, and he's bold. He doesn't flinch from taking down powerful people. People like the idea that bad people will be punished, even if it's only in an imaginary narrative. But and last thing I'd say is that there's just the beauty of the poem itself, the profound originality of the Divine Comedy, and just the tremendous range of subjects that he addresses: science, philosophy, religious, literature. It's just unending. It's an encyclopedia of the medieval world. What are your thoughts on why Dante is still relevant today?
I echo everything you've said. I mean, you definitely said many of the things I would say. A few more points that I can think of. I think it's really interesting, the concept of the meme. When you have a figure from the past or a popular figure even today who becomes a stand-in for something like Machiavelli for power. Dante has a number of interesting memes that people really relate to today. And one of the first ones that is always sort of surprising to those of us who've read the entire Divine Comedy is fire and hot and burning. And so one of the things that this website that we'll talk about later that I and my colleague Beth Cogashow co-edit, so many hot sauces. And so we have all of these examples of that. We have punishment and vindication, as you mentioned. And another thing we see again and again are references to a new circle of hell, like Twitter is the 45th circle of hell, or things like long lists of reimagining the 9 circles of hell. Like I have one here, the jalapeno burger, or another thing like the Google Plus circles. There was this one particular illustration of a person at a computer, and it said, do you know who else put his friends in circles? Dante. So there's just hundreds and hundreds of ways in which Dante's structure keeps being appealing to people today. And, you know, as we're talking about this too, I am always dismayed that fewer people know about Beatrice and his beloved muse and person and figure who helps him through his life and through his journey towards salvation. Another thing that I think Dante appeals to today, there's sort of fascination with the Middle Ages that's been going on for a very long time. You see it in fantasy novels and TV shows and movies. You see it in gaming culture. Unfortunately, you can also see it in politics and right-wing ideologies, this return to an ideal Middle Ages. So we have that. And as you mentioned, this highly visual nature of the Inferno in particular, and Purgatory. And as you were also mentioning, the way in which it's encyclopedic also lends itself to a relatability through that goes across race and class and time and gender and religion and creed. It is, of course, a medieval Catholic text, and yet it continues and continues to find adherents and fans in every walk of life. And so that sort of leads me to the next question that we've been thinking about, is this relatability across such a diverse readership. And it's really fascinating to think about what parts in particular of his poem, besides the other things he wrote and who he was as a person, what parts of the commedia resonate with contemporary readers. And I just made a note of a few of my students' favorites that I'm sure are going to be similar to yours, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts. Students continue to love the love story of Paolo and Francesca. They continue to despair with the idea of the dead wood of the suicides. They continue to marvel at how Ulysses' quest for knowledge is potentially condemnable, because of course they think that a quest for knowledge in college is exactly what they should be doing. They find the guardians of hell fascinating in their hybridity, and lots of questions around that. Why is Dante putting classical figures in a Christian hell? They feel outrage. They feel outrage at pagans and unbaptized people being in hell, as well as sodomites and bankers. And these two things in particular upset them, and a few others. They really, of course, recoil at the potential cannibalism of Ugolino, and they despair when Virgil departs. So these are some of the things that that resonate. And as I just taught this yesterday or the other day, they're always shocked when the first encounter of Dante Pilgrim with Beatrice is such a tough one, how tough she is on him, this beloved angelic figure that we've been hearing about. And the last thing I would say is this idea, they find paradiso difficult. They love the beauty of the poetry, the light imagery, the weather imagery, some of the paradoxes in space and time, and they love that he reaches his goal, but the Christian doctrine is heavy and hard for a lot of our readers. So I turn it over to you. These are some of the things I drew out of my experience of teaching the Commedia.
My students, like many of the cantos that your students do, and it's ever a wonder to be able to teach students today and to see each class. And in my case, it's been almost 30 years of teaching the Divine Comedy, engage with the poem, and that it's just one of the most satisfying aspects of my job today. But yeah, my students, like many of the same cantos, they're the big ones that were identified by Francesco de Sancti so many years ago. So yeah, that would be the very poignant story, love story between Paolo and Francesca, and also the fact that they're taken in by a tale of romance. Mm-hmm. That's something that students can identify with. Other cantos that resonate greatly include Farinata and Cavalcanti. Farinata's overwhelming political passions, and Cavalcanti's love for his son. Many readers are very touched by what I consider largely the most personal of the encounters in hell, and Dante's meeting with a former mentor in Brunetto Latini, who essentially delivers a kind of lesson in hell. Then there's also Piero's devastating story of his devotion to the emperor, and what that led to, the jealousy of other courtiers, and the despair over his imprisonment. And of course, there's the marvelous Ulysses canto, this unquenchable wanderlust that drives him. But yeah, I would agree that it's the relationship that one of the parts of the poem which most resonates with young readers especially is the relationship between Dante and Virgil. Virgil is just always there, and students just hate it when they come to realize that Virgil is not saved. Just about every reader, not only young readers, but older readers, everybody wants Virgil to be saved. And, in a sense, that raises another issue, and that Virgil is, of course, not the only guide. He's more the moral and literary guide, and then we have Beatrice as the spiritual guide. But in both of these these guides, and they're not the only two, because we have Saint Bernard at the end in Paradiso too. But with Virgil especially, I think many readers can relate to this idea of a mentor-mentee. I don't know, what do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I have had students in classes over the years, especially classics majors, who really combed through the poem to try to find clues or hints to see if maybe Virgil is saved. He disappears. We don't see him again. We don't 100% know that he went back to limbo. And he went through all the penitent levels that Dante did, of course, in Purgatory. So much that we could say about that, and we won't, but the students, there are always a few who are convinced that it's an open question. And then this other point you mentioned, of course, about, you know, the mentor-mentee human guide, Virgil as rational reason, of course, and Beatrice as, you know, a spiritual guide and doctrine. And then Bernard, they find very unsettling in a way. Why isn't it Beatrice who takes them the last few steps of the way? Why does it have to be somebody else? Who is this figure? So that is something that students definitely fixate on. On the other hand, the question, I shouldn't say the question, this thought also that Dante has both a male and a female guide pleases contemporary students a great deal, and a lot of our female readers, and they're really happy to see the power that Dante, poet, gives to a female character in the care of his soul and his education. So building on some of these thoughts of what parts of the Commedia are most striking to readers, at least our students, as we've been talking about it, it's interesting to think about how Dante speaks to readers more generally. And in part, you know, Dante is our guide, Dante is an exile. Many people who are struggling in their own lives can relate to him in that way. And I want to just mention a few of the things, again, the students, why they love reading the Commedia, even 700 years later in America. Some of them want to connect to their Italian heritage. They come to the class because they've heard of Dante, especially, of course, the Inferno. Some want to connect to their religious upbringing. Some are majoring in art history or classics and have heard of Dante and want to read him for themselves. Some are attracted to the project of reading a famous work of Western civilization and to seeing how or how not, or how the world has changed or how it has not. And so there's, you know, so many debates now about canon. And so in some ways, there are students who are wanting to explore, well, why is this canon? Should it still be canon? And I think that those are very important questions that also draw students to the poem. And then, you know, perhaps the most, you know, superficial reason that I have seen students be excited about Dante, at least initially, is that they've played some video games, some called Inferno, Assassin's Creed 2, set in Florence. There are ways in which very much pop culture can bring people, Dan Brown, which I know you will talk about, can bring people back to the original. So those are some of my thoughts. How about you?
I'm finding this year, teaching Dante this year is different from any other year. And we're all teaching during COVID. And in my case, I'm teaching in person. So I have a really acute sense of what appeals to the students. But recently I did poll them, and I think that a lot of them they find comfort in reading a story about someone who was initially lost, that first canto when Dante finds himself lost in a dark wood. And then nevertheless, and then what is most heartening is that he emerges from hell, the savage place, to see the stars. And one student told me that reading Dante during COVID reminds her that there is still humor, hope, and friendship, even in the darkest places. Like your students of Italian heritage, of course, Italo-Americans want to connect with the greatest figures of their heritage. And yeah, some of the most enthusiastic younger readers are literature specialists. They like recognizing how Dante relates to other works that they've already read, Classic students like recognizing how Dante uses earlier classical culture to produce a Christian epic. And they're always curious about how these two very different worlds, the classical and the Christian, intersect. And yeah, so we always have very lively conversations about that. More generally, I would say that many readers like the idea of just punishment. Of course, here I'm speaking primarily of the Inferno, but that is, after all, the part of the poem that most readers know. We're used to, today, we're so used to seeing people getting away with so much, aren't we? World leaders can have someone poisoned or chopped to pieces in an embassy. Nothing happens to them. And at least with the Inferno, we see comeuppance, and that's satisfying. And in this age of political divisiveness, where people are often greatly disappointed with their leaders, the idea that someone will get a just return for their actions, I think that idea can be strangely appealing. And I've also found that older readers, I've had older students in my classes, often some of them are retired, and they think about the poem quite differently. And what resonates with them is quite different as well. And I always think it's wonderful if I have older students as well as the regular students, and they can see just how differently these older students respond to the poem, and also that this is in some ways an example of what they could be many years from now, after, maybe at the time when they have grandchildren, that there is something to being constantly engaged with a masterpiece such as the Divine Comedy. But I would say that older readers feel that Dante holds the key to living a good life. In Dante's analysis of ethical and unethical behavior, and where that gets you, the comedy prompts us to accept the responsibility for the way we live. And I think I've heard this from readers of all ages. As Dante goes on his journey, readers make their own journey, all kinds of journeys. Dante just simply casts a spell on us, and we enter into the journey as if it was real, as he then tells us near the Geryon episode. And I just love seeing readers, whether they're younger or older, enthralled with the poem.
It's very interesting to think about the different demographics, different groups of people at different ages, different moments of their life, but also different circumstances and identities, and how Dante speaks to them and why. Yeah.
Well, I think we might, we've talked a lot about what appeals to readers of various ages, but we could maybe talk a little bit about what really causes the two of us to be Dante addicts. And I would say that as far as myself, I'm drawn largely to the depth and range of the portrait of humanity. Since I read the Inferno for the first time as a master's student, Dante has prompted me to, over the decades, I would say at this point, to ponder the consequences of different behaviors. And I just love the Eighth Circle. This intricate examination of how fraud corrodes communities, how sins like hypocrisy, lying, and flattery are interconnected. Then there's the originality of the comparisons, this extraordinary ability that Dante has to compare something most ordinary, ivy clinging to a vine or wax melting, to something unreal, something extraordinary, a shade and a snake metamorphizing into just one unimaginable hybrid creature. And then in the Eighth Circle too, there's just the linguistic virtuosity, the use of so many different stylistic registers. And maybe I think, final thoughts on why I like the Eighth Circle so much is it really forces us to think, why is fraud worse than murder? And because that's what many people think today, that they can't that is the worst sin. But when they see the extensive treatment of fraud, which is almost a half of the poem, I think it really prompts us to think differently. The other thing that draws me to the poem is that judgments, what we think about ethical, unethical behavior, Dante, of course, would see this in terms of sins, really changes over time. And whereas he puts neutrality, it's not even in hell proper, but just in the sort of the vestibule of hell, that's really changed. People want people to take positions to the point where there have been some kind of distortions of neutrality. JFK, for example, thought that one of his favorite expressions was, the darkest places in hell are reserved for those who in a time of moral crisis remain neutral. So, and MLK too condemned neutrality in his speech against the Vietnam War. Then I would also say that, thinking about why I'm a Dante addict, that I find myself thinking at different points in my life of lines in the poem. And lines are just, sometimes it's just a phrase or two lines, because they capture so well the essence of a situation. And most recently, I mean, just even 2 days ago, I was thinking about Dante's reference to a triste ruina, a world which strips itself of good, in his meeting. This takes place in his meeting with Forese Donati. And I think Dante offers us an endless repository of these concise, distilled sentiments. He just is a master of distilling something to its essence, what Eliot called concentration without elimination. So, and I think of those lines that he utters when he sees Forese, when pondering, for example, things like the pernicious effects of systemic injustices, or even more mundane matters such as the marginalization of the humanities, and that affects the subjects subjects like art and literature, and therefore the teaching of Dante. What about you? What are the parts of the poem that really resonate with you?
It's so hard to follow you, Deborah, because you've said so many incredible things and right things and things that I completely agree with, even though I had never thought of picking a section of the poem like the eighth circle, like a circle, and discussing it in the way you have. I love what you've done in really going deep into the question of why fraud and why that is of interest to you, but especially your comments about the language, the complexity, the metaphors, the phrases we can use in our own lives, absolutely. And when I contemplated this question before speaking today, I came up with my initial and gut reaction to, why do I keep reading the poem? Why do I keep wanting to share it with others? Why do I keep teaching it with the joy with which we teach it? It's one word. And for me, so I'm going to take us out from the dark and move it to the light, to the word love. And I love how much love there is in the poem, actually, at the root of everything. How the journey is fueled by love, how many discussions of love, and how love is the objective. I love how many kinds of love we explore with Dante on the journey. I love, even though I find this very difficult to understand, I love how even hell was created by love. I love seeing students love a character in the poem, a verse, a rhyme, a metaphor, a story. I love reading students' contemplations on love and their analyses of the poem through fascination and love. And I love that Dante gives us a means to view even politics through love. So even though he's, of course, critiquing and punishing and showing us the worst of human nature and character, I obviously, we all, when we read the poem, also understand that his hope is to move us towards love of each other, communities, of the world, of course, of God. And, you know, because so much of what we've talked about has in fact focused on hell, which is the most known of the three canticles, I'm always really intrigued when I see a contemporary reference to paradise. And I love seeing Dante remembered for his mission of love.